You're standing in a stone courtyard somewhere in the Maya lowlands, maybe 8th century CE, and carved directly into the floor, beneath your feet, is a grid of shallow lines, worn smooth by generations of hands and feet passing over it. Nobody built this. Not officially. No architect drew it into the plans for this palace. Somebody, probably more than one somebody, over more than one lifetime, scratched it into the stone themselves, in a spot where they clearly expected to come back to it again and again. It's a game board. The fact that we found dozens of these things, carved illegally into the floors and benches of some of the most important buildings in the Maya world, tells you something almost nobody talks about when they talk about this civilization. We spend so much time on the pyramids, the astronomy, the collapse, the human sacrifice, that we tend to skip the most basic question of all. When a Maya person wasn't farming, wasn't building, wasn't performing a ritual, what did they actually do with the hours in between? So today we're doing exactly that. We're going to get into a gambling game so old nobody can prove when it started, a drink that got an entire class of people drunk at state expense, a sport that doubled as a religious event, and one very strange detail about game boards scratched into royal palaces that tells you something surprising about who was actually killing time in there. Let's go. Here's the problem you run into immediately if you try to research this, and it's worth naming up front because it shapes everything else. Almost everything that survives from the Maya world was written, carved, or painted for official reasons. Royal inscriptions record conquests, marriages, astronomical events, the accession of kings. The temple art depicts gods, rulers, and ritual. Nobody in the 8th century was carving a monument that says, "Here is what an ordinary farmer did on a slow afternoon in the rainy season." The written record, in other words, is aggressively skewed toward power, ceremony, and cosmology, and almost completely silent on the boring human question of downtime. Which means, exactly like with the Egyptian evidence we've dug through on this channel before, we have to work this out, sideways, through side evidence, through what people scratched into floors when nobody official was watching, through Spanish friars writing down what they saw generations later, through the objects that happened to survive by accident rather than by design. Let's start with that game board, because it's the best clue we've got, and it's genuinely strange once you sit with it. The game is called patolli, and it shows up not just in the Maya region, but across huge stretches of Mesoamerica, played on a board typically shaped like a cross or a grid, using beans or seeds as dice and a set of markers you race across the board, trying to be the first to get all your pieces around and captures the opponents along the way. Archaeologists have found patolli boards carved into the floors and benches of palaces, temple platforms, even inside elite residential compounds, and here's the detail that makes this interesting rather than just cute. Some of the boards found in ceremonial spaces appear to have been carved crudely, informally, into surfaces that were clearly built for a completely different, much more serious purpose. In other words, somebody, possibly a noble, possibly a low-ranking priest, with a lot of downtime between rituals, possibly even a servant killing time while waiting for someone important to finish a meeting, scratched a game board into a sacred building because they wanted something to do with their hands and their attention while they waited around. That's not a monument. That's the ancient equivalent of doodling on a desk during a boring shift, and it might be one of the most relatable pieces of evidence in all of Maya archaeology. The theory's a closely related game called bull, sometimes called paluk. That's still played today by some Maya communities in Belize and the Guatemalan highlands, using corn kernels thrown like dice and pieces that move across a board trying to capture the opponent's markers. And this is a case where you have to be honest about the limits of the evidence rather than paper over them. We know from linguistic evidence that the word bull appears across multiple Mayan languages and consistently means to play with dice, sometimes extended to mean to lose at gambling, which tells you gambling with thrown objects was clearly a known, named concept in the pre-colonial Maya world. No archaeologist has yet found a confirmed ancient bull board, the physical kind carved in stone, the way patolli boards have turned up repeatedly. So we genuinely don't know for certain whether the specific game played today under that name is a direct continuation of something ancient, or whether it developed after contact with the Spanish and simply inherited an old word for gambling that already existed. This is exactly the kind of gap serious researchers sit with, honestly, instead of smoothing over, and it's worth remembering here because it's going to matter again in a minute when we talk about how confidently people claim to know what the Maya did for fun. Now let's talk about the big one, the sport everybody's already heard of, because the Maya version of the Mesoamerican ball game, known in some Maya languages as Pitz, deserves a slightly different treatment here than the version we've covered before on this channel with other Mesoamerican cultures. Ball courts show up at Maya sites across the entire region, from small local courts clearly built for local play, all the way up to the enormous Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza, and the honest picture, the same way it was with the sport elsewhere in Mesoamerica, is that this wasn't one single uniform activity with one single meaning. At smaller sites and in less ceremonially loaded contexts, there's real reason to believe this functioned as something much closer to a genuinely recreational sport, something people played, watched, and almost certainly gambled on, the same way you'd expect any physically demanding, skill-based game, with a crowd around it, to attract betting in basically any human society across history. The largest, most politically significant courts, tied to state ceremony and royal spectacle, the game clearly carried heavier religious and political weight, sometimes connected to warfare, captive taking, and in some documented contexts, ritual execution disguised in the format of a match. Both of those things are true at once, in different places, and flattening the entire Maya ballgame tradition into either pure sport or pure human sacrifice misses the actual texture of what the evidence shows, which is a spectrum, the same way it was for their Aztec neighbors centuries later. Let's move off the courts and into something that gets talked about far less, which is drinking, because the Maya world had at least two documented substances specifically associated with relaxation, celebration, and, in at least one case, state-sanctioned intoxication on a fairly large scale. The first is chocolate, and it's worth being precise here because the popular version of this story gets simplified into something misleading. Maya chocolate, cacao prepared as a drink, was not the sweet dessert-style hot chocolate we're used to. It was typically bitter, sometimes spiced with chili, occasionally frothed into a thick foam that appears repeatedly in Maya vase painting as a marker of status and hospitality, served at feasts, exchanged as a valuable trade good, and closely associated with elite social life, specifically because cacao itself was expensive, and not something an ordinary farming household had easy daily access to. This wasn't a universal, everyday leisure drink the way we'd think of coffee today. It was closer to a luxury good whose consumption was itself a form of status display, which tells you something interesting about Maya leisure generally, that even relaxation and hospitality were stratified along the same class lines as everything else in this society. The second substance is balché, a fermented drink made from the bark of the balché tree soaked in honey water, and this one comes with genuinely strong documentary evidence because Spanish friars, horrified by what they were watching, wrote about it directly. Balché was consumed at communal ceremonies and festivals, sometimes in enormous quantities, and multiple colonial-era accounts describe entire communities becoming visibly, heavily intoxicated during these events, which were simultaneously religious ceremonies, social gatherings, and, by every honest reading of the sources, genuine parties. This wasn't a shameful secret vice hidden from the historical record. It was public, communal, and apparently expected, tied to specific festivals and calendar dates, which puts it in an interesting middle category, not purely religious obligation, not purely recreational drinking, but something that treated those two categories as far more intertwined than most of us instinctively assume they have to be. Music and dance deserve their own moment here, because this is one of the areas where the evidence is unusually rich, thanks to painted ceramics that survive in genuinely large numbers and depict scenes of court life in vivid, specific detail. Maya vase painting repeatedly shows musicians playing drums, rattles, whistles, trumpets made from conch shells or wood, and flutes carved from clay or bone, often accompanying dancers wearing elaborate costume and headdress at what are clearly festival or courtly gatherings rather than purely private ritual. Archaeologists have physically recovered huge numbers of ceramic whistles and ocarinas shaped like animals, gods, and human figures, well preserved enough in some cases that modern researchers have actually played them and recorded the sound, which means we have something genuinely rare in ancient history: actual audio, or at least an actual physical instrument capable of reproducing something close to the original sound a Maya musician would have made. Combine that with the fact that these instruments turn up not just at temples, but scattered across ordinary residential contexts too, and you get a picture of music as something that existed at every level of this society, not solely as an elite or priestly monopoly. There is a detail that tends to surprise people because it doesn't fit the mental image of Maya society as endlessly serious and ceremonial, and it's about children. Archaeologists working Maya residential sites have recovered small ceramic figurines, some clearly designed as toys rather than ritual objects, based on wear patterns and context, including figures with movable, articulated limbs, animal figures, and, in a detail that genuinely startled early 20th century archaeologists when they first encountered it, small ceramic animals mounted on little wheeled platforms. The Maya and Mesoamerican cultures more broadly understood the wheel as a mechanical principle, simply never applied it to transportation, likely because they had no large domesticated draft animals capable of pulling a wheeled cart, and because the terrain across much of the Maya lowlands, dense jungle, limited road infrastructure, made wheeled vehicles genuinely impractical compared to human portage. But the wheel itself as an idea existed, and the place it survives archaeologically almost exclusively is inside children's toys, which is either a very small footnote or, depending on how you want to look at it, a quietly poignant detail about a piece of technology that existed in this civilization only as something to play with. But storytelling and oral performance almost certainly filled an enormous amount of Maya leisure time, and this is a case where the evidence is frustratingly indirect but still genuinely convincing. The Popol Vuh, the Quiche Maya narrative we've referenced before on this channel, survived specifically because it was eventually written down in the Latin alphabet after the conquest, but its content, internal structure, and repetitive, performative language patterns strongly suggest it existed for a long time as spoken, memorized, performed narrative before it was ever committed to any written form, the kind of material told and retold at gatherings, likely with real performative flair, rather than read silently off a page the way we'd consume a story today. Maya hieroglyphic writing itself was never a mass literacy system available to ordinary farmers. It appears to have been controlled largely by scribes, priests, and elite specialists, which means for the vast majority of Maya people across the entire history of this civilization, story wasn't something you read. It was something you heard at a festival, around a fire, from someone whose actual job, at least some of the time, was remembering it correctly and telling it well, which puts the ordinary Maya evening a lot closer to the fireside storytelling tradition we've talked about with much earlier hunter-gatherer societies on this channel than you might expect from civilization known for stone pyramids and complex mathematics. So let's pull all of this together, because the honest picture that emerges is more layered than either of the two extremes people tend to default to, either imagining the Maya as endlessly grim and ritual-obsessed with no real concept of relaxation, or swinging too far the other way and imagining leisure as some kind of universal, classless activity everybody accessed equally. Neither is quite right. Leisure in the Maya world was stratified the same way almost everything else in this society was stratified. Elite leisure looked like feasting on bitter chocolate, watching or sponsoring high-stakes ball games at monumental courts, being entertained by court musicians and dancers depicted in painted vessels clearly made to be seen and admired. Ordinary leisure, the kind that leaves far less evidence precisely because it required fewer expensive, durable materials, looked more like a gambling game scratched into whatever flat surface was available. Communal festival drinking that briefly erased at least some of the usual social distance, music played on cheap, mass-producible ceramic whistles rather than commissioned court instruments, and stories told aloud, for free, requiring nothing but a voice and an audience willing to listen. Both of those parallel tracks existed at once, across the same centuries, inside the same civilization, and the accidental survival of one particular kind of evidence, a game board someone wasn't supposed to carve into a palace floor, is honestly one of the best windows we have into the second, quieter, much less monumental version of Maya life, the one nobody was building a temple to commemorate. So here's the question. Somewhere in a Maya palace, over 1,000 years ago, someone risked scratching an unauthorized game board into sacred stone because they were bored and wanted something to do while they waited. It's the modern equivalent of that, the small, unofficial, slightly rebellious thing you do to pass time in a place where you're technically supposed to be doing something else. Let me know in the comments. See you soon.